So hi everyone, I'm here with Bernie Smith, who's an author and a consultant, really with expertise in KPIs. So Bernie, thanks very much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me along.
So in the whole world of sort of KPIs and dashboards and business intelligence, I suppose. I mean, what are you seeing now, especially through the lockdown period? And what are people looking for now? I mean, do they still have gaps in what they measure and stuff? And what's your latest kind of view of the industry, really?
Yeah, well, we all have our little bubble that we live in. My bubble, really, book sales is one of the things that tells me a lot about what's going on. So I've seen waves of real increases in interest. So I saw my book sales treble pretty much overnight during the first lockdown. You find that it wanes a little bit and then it resurges. So there's obviously a lot of people out there thinking about measurement. And I started sort of wondering why this was. And I guess what's happening is so much more is happening virtually that I think people are having to rely on the instrumentation more. So if you're on a surface ship, you can look and see land and see other ships. If you're in a submarine, suddenly you become loads more dependent on things like sonar and GPS and whatever. And I think that's what's happening in certain businesses. They've realised that they're having to rely on data more because you can't look people in the eye, you can't walk around the office. So they're starting to think about measuring things that probably they would have relied on intuition or gut feel in the past. But it's quite a fragmented picture. So some industries are overwhelmed and are seeing demand like they've never seen before. Others are in the doldrums. There's lots of different pictures out there. So I don't think you can generalize, but I have definitely seen a big uptick in interest in performance measurement. That's definitely safe to say.
Where do you see the main interest from? I think we were chatting before and talking about like the finance function as an example. I spend quite a lot of time talking with operations folks or credit risk folks. I mean, is there any sort of like themes around particular areas that are sort of really driving the interest in sort of the whole idea around measurement, I suppose?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So my background's engineering and operational improvement. So I kind of expected that to be where the pool comes from, but that's not the case. So I have a number of partnerships now with training organizations in the accounting world. So I work with a couple of partners in the US and one in the Netherlands, which is the professional body. And it's largely FDs, financial controllers and whatever that are looking at the measures they currently have control of and realizing it's not the whole picture. And they seem really interested in broadening their scope and broadening the service they offer to the business, because finance KPIs are obviously essential and a legal requirement, but they're almost all lagging. So a lot of FDs are looking at it going, well, how can we get ahead of the curve? How can we figure out what we need to do and when we've got a problem before it results in a bottom line issue? So huge amount of demand from the world of finance, and interestingly also from accountants as well. So accountants are trying, I think they see the cold wind of AI blowing through the profession. So it's no longer good enough just to know the rules and be able to do the books. They're looking to be trusted business advisors. So again, they're expanding their scope, and KPIs is the obvious springboard. They're already very data literate. They're already involved in reporting. So the question is, how can we add value to our business or to our clients' business? So that seems to be where I'm getting a lot of demand from at the moment.
And I suppose some of that's a bit of a trend. I mean, you sort of saw that with some of the large big five consultancies, like the big consultancies, stroke accounting firms, where they've been promoting, I suppose, almost like the finance departments doing more than that and sort of becoming the BI department. And I imagine it probably links into things like balanced scorecard coming through, and so like there's this sort of gradual expansion of almost like the accountancy profession to a certain extent into like insight as much as just financial reporting, I suppose.
Yeah. I think a lot of finance people want to be a sort of consigliere, if you'll excuse the Godfather reference. They're definitely moving into the trusted advisor, internal consultant space, and KPIs is the way to do that, because that's the way you stop being just someone with an opinion and actually start being someone with a objective, factual insight that you can offer the rest of the business. And they're normally perfectly positioned to do that.
And do you think that's a reflection of the fact that the measurement in a lot of businesses is really not as good as it needs to be? I mean, in terms of like big challenges, always around getting data often, isn't it? It's like, how do you actually produce the data? Is it in usable format? Those kind of things. Is it a reflection of the state that businesses are in? I mean that they were much more sort of reliant on almost like direct observation rather than sort of KPIs and sort of, I suppose, indirect measurement or measurements and reporting.
Let me just share a picture that basically summarizes what I see in most organizations. Can you see that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so this, forgive me if I've already shown this to you before, but this is a street that I saw in the Canary Islands a few years ago. And what you see in the street is a local council that went down the street and really carefully laid a wavy pavement around about 30 mature trees in the street. Now, the same council went down the same street not very long afterwards, because it's, believe it or not, it's actually fairly recently resurfaced this. It doesn't look it because it's just rained. And they chopped all the trees down. And those two decisions made perfect sense in isolation, but the end result made no sense at all. And I think this is what lots of businesses are waking up to. They've got intelligent people, they're motivated, they're doing the best thing that they can, but the overall effect, the overall result is not coordinated, and it's not taking them towards where they need to go. So I think that the big challenge in almost every organization, but particularly in big organizations, just because you've got more people, is this lack of coherence, this lack of coordination. So I think there's always been good stuff going on in any business. You can go into any business, and I was in Unilever probably a decade ago, and they had fantastic operational measurement, live plasma screens as they were then in the canteen with live OEE and yield and everything else. Chances are, though, if you go to another part of the business, it won't be coherent, it won't stack up, it won't align with that approach. So I think there's always pockets of excellence in any business at any given time. But the big challenge is finding a common language that, and a common method that everyone can get behind so that everything aligns. And ultimately, it's all got to join up at the top, because it's all got to service our strategy. It's all got to deliver on the outcomes that we're looking for as an organization. And I think that's the big challenge. So most organizations have got some strategy or objectives or things they're working towards. They've mostly got some good KPIs, some of which link, some of which don't. But that big picture typically tends to be a bit cloudy. And it's often owned partly by the IT team, the MI team, the BI team, and then partly by the execs, sort of top level stats. They're the customer, and there's often a big disconnect between the two. So you've got the techie people, trying to stay on top of the security challenges and managing the data and keeping costs down and focused on what's deliverable, and then the business, which is craving business insight, and the two often don't join up.
Yeah. And I suppose one of the challenges you often have is, a couple of challenges. You can either have not enough data or too much data. So data could be a challenge.
Yeah.
So you handle that, and then what comes out of that is almost like too many measures, right? So and how do you think about that in terms of just challenges around data and then challenges around getting the right measures, I suppose?
Yeah. So they're both really, really interesting problems. The one about too many measures is an absolute perennial one. Now, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. Firstly, there is a hierarchy. So I'm working with a client at the moment to build a scorecard. Now, one of their highly bright, highly intelligent, motivated people has come back and said, I can't do 10 KPIs. I need 140. And okay, right. So what you're talking about is all the KPIs you need to run your business. Now, that's slightly different from what KPIs do we need on the scorecard. So if you had one KPI for a business, I guess most people would choose profit. Now, you can't run a whole business on that, but it's an outcome. It's an outcome of hundreds and hundreds of things happening and going right or going wrong. So what you can do is you can drop down the hierarchy. So if you're in a manufacturing business, you could say, well, it's OEE, efficiency, it's yield, it's unit profit, for example. Those would be high-level outcomes. So if you want to bring things under control, identify the high-level outcomes that you need to monitor, and you can normally bring the field down dramatically. Now, at an individual KPI level, there's two questions we can ask as well. That is, how important is this KPI? Now, that sounds obvious, but then there's also how easy is it to measure? And as part of my method, the results orientated KPI system, that's how we take that hierarchy of KPIs that we identify visually using something called a KPI tree. That always produces too many KPIs. And then we do the shortlisting process where we ask, how important is it and how easy is it or hard is it to measure? Now, the reason that's so useful is it does two things. It helps us eliminate KPIs that are perhaps easy but not that important. Now, you think they're not that common in organizations, but they are everywhere. As soon as Verin or SAP come in or consultants come in and put a new system in, the first thing they do once the system is just about up and running or limping along in most cases is they switch on every report because they want to look like they've delivered value. So suddenly the business is ears deep in 500-page reports that make no sense at all. So giving ourselves permission to stop measuring things that are easy but trivial is the first result. I actually said two, there's three outcomes here. Secondly, things that are important and easy to measure, that's easy. They just go on our dashboard and reports and off you go. But the gold bars actually sit in the important but hard to measure category. Because these are the ones that get completely forgotten. They get overlooked, they get pushed to one side because everyone goes, oh, they're impossible. But experience tells me there is nothing that's impossible to measure. Sometimes you have to go for proxy measures. So you can't directly measure the thing that you're interested in, but everything is always measurable if you care enough about it and you're prepared to put some resource, time and effort into it. So that's the process I use to bring that list down under control. And the nice thing is because they're scored, there is no hard cutoff. So you end up with a ranking between 0 and 100. 100 is super important, so that'd be cash in bank or catastrophic safety issues, for example. A 10 is trivially easy to measure. So cash and bank will be another one that's an 8, 9 or 10 in most businesses. So going through that process, you end up with this hierarchy, this ranked list, and then it's a business decision. We go down and we say, okay, obviously we're going to do the ones at the top. Let's work down the list, make a decision about which ones we're going to do now, which ones we're going to do in the future.
One of the Achilles heels of around like KPI adoptions is also like organizational buy-in as well. So you just talked about there around sort of like how you sort of you talk about it, talk with people around getting buy-in around what the priority of order is in terms of I suppose the priority of adoption of each of the KPIs as well. I mean how do you think about that? Because if people aren't adopting it, then or they kick back against the measures that are being suggested, then they don't get used, and then they go to the other 20 ones.
So I have a confession here. So I'm probably on the slightly aspergic end of the spectrum, and I tend to look at problems rather than people. Okay, and I got an almighty wake-up call in a matrix management consulting organisation that I worked with about 12 years ago. So I cooked up what I thought was a genius set of KPIs and dashboards. Thought I'd identified the stakeholders and missed about 20 people off the list. And there was then the experience of basically a bear fight when we had a meeting where these 20 non-engaged, very, very disgruntled stakeholders turned up and ripped me to shreds. And I learned at that stage that the second thing on the list, after you decide what you want to do as a business, is you get the right people on a list, then in a room, and then regularly engaged at every single step of the process as you go through. So in my method, step 1 is figuring out what you want to achieve. Step 2 is identifying the right people. And I've built the whole process to be collaborative, because if people are not intimately involved in every step, then they will not fully engage, they will not fully support what it is that we're trying to do. So couldn't be more important.
What's interesting during lockdown is almost like that the people interaction piece is important, right? And as data people, like we like to be in the numbers, like to look through the through the reports, generating metrics, KPIs, etc. But the people side is still important. And so how are you finding that in terms of that engagement through doing it remotely or not being able to see people face to face?
Yeah, so actually it's worked surprisingly well. So and the reason I think is that the process is intensely visual. So I'm a visual person, and the heart of the method I use is something called a KPI tree. Now, what we've been doing is we've been building those in a virtual whiteboarding tool called Miro. So it's actually worked really well because when you're doing a classroom session or a seminar room session, typically you've got one person on the computer or someone on the whiteboard controlling the tree build process. But when you use something like Miro, you can genuinely all have hands-on on the diagram. So if you do it right, it's actually a superior experience. Now, you don't have the informal sort of coffee chats and whatever that you get face-to-face. So I miss that. But a lot of the online facilitation tools, if you use them intelligently, then they become really powerful. However, I had an amazing Radio 4 program a little while ago about machines that change the world, and they talked about how people implement new technology. Sorry, I'm going slightly off beam here. Stop me if it's too random. So they were talking in that program about how when factories went from steam engines to electric motors, they just took the steam engine and they changed it for an electric motor. Now, factories were designed to run with a line shaft all the way down, and all the machines in the factory ran off this one line shaft, which was driven by a steam engine. That's because you had one big steam engine. So when they first implemented electric motors, they did that. They put one big electric motor in and had everything running off that. And it didn't work particularly well. And it took them about a decade to realize that what you do is you stick a small electric motor in every other machine. You can put the machines where you like. And I think online tools are the same. I think we're all falling out of the classroom and online, in with a sense of urgency because of COVID, and we're trying to use the tools in the same way that we would have used a whiteboard and a flip chart. Actually, the value comes from using them a little bit differently, and I think we're all kind of exploring how to use those tools. I think some quite powerful lessons will come out of that.
So, talking a bit about dashboards, I want to ask you about dashboards and reporting and BI tools that are out there as well. I mean, we talked a bit about the creation of the MI, creation of various KPIs, the extraction of the data, but it has to be visualized in some way. And so that's been quite a hot theme, I suppose, over the last few years. And it'd be good to get your kind of view on it in terms of like where it's been developing, what the value of it is. How do you think about that and integrate it into businesses you work with?
So this was something I thought about quite a lot when I developed my ROCS method of 2012. There's a lot of very good thinking that's been done, a comparatively long time ago by people like Steve Few and Edward Tufte on visual design as a means of understanding things. So these two schools of thought out there. There's the people who want things to be easy to understand, intuitive, quick, and then there's the people who want to impress. And I think for a long time, the people who wanted to impress sort of lived in the software world. We've all seen beautifully three-dimensionally rendered pressure gauges and volume knobs and things like that. And that's from what I call the world of bling. People who want to put up a dashboard want to get a gasp really quickly. And I think people have realized that's a bit like having a diet of sweets. It's fine for the first couple of mouthfuls, and after a couple of days, you're heartily sick of it. It's not actually helping you with your goal, which should be around making the right business decisions. So to make the right business decisions, the presentation layer needs to be almost invisible. When you look at a road sign, you do not want to think about the quality of the artwork. You want to know there's a cattle grid 50 meters ahead, or that there's a giveaway line 100 meters ahead. So I think the world of visual design and visual presentation has grown up, and I think people are realizing that the job of dashboards and reports is not to impress. It's to get out of the way. It's to become so intuitive that you almost don't see it. And the way you do that is by following the rules of good visual design. And sort of put very briefly, it is about using minimal encoding. So minimal use of color, minimal use of lines, minimal use of any visual clutter that does not convey information. It's about brutal simplicity. Use the simplest possible type of charts, the least amount of encoding, and it's about being consistent. Because if we want to intuitively understand something, we need to harness short and long-term memory, and also something called iconic memory. So we need to be relentlessly consistent and rules-based and standard-based in our approach. So that's the way it's moving. And I did some work myself. I developed something called the Brilliant Excel Dashboard Kit, which was applying these principles. And then I met a guy called Jürgen. So Dr. Jürgen Feist, and he teamed up with an ex-McKinsey consultant called Professor Hickert, and they came up with something called the International Business Communication Standard. And I was just reaching for a copy of their book. They have taken all of these principles and they have done a fantastic job of creating a visual standard called the IBCS, the International Business Communication Standard. Now, I've had the pleasure of talking with Jürgen on a number of speaking tours. Fantastic guy. They've done an amazing job. And one of the strengths of IBCS is it's now supported natively in SAP. It's supported pretty well through third-party plugins in Click and to a lesser extent Tableau. And Zebra BI support it in Excel, as do HighChart and various other people. So there's a good standard out there based on really sound principles. And I think this is the way the market should be going. This is massive for mainland Europe. It's less well known in the UK and the US for some reason, but I think that will change. So I think minimalism, standards based, in the same way that a musician doesn't assert their creativity by the way in which they write the music notes down. As business professionals, we shouldn't be trying to express our creativity through how we create charts. It should be in other ways.
And how do you feel about that with AI? I suppose AI has been talked about, has been a bit of a has had a lot of profile, and I use AI, but I mean talk about machine learning, I suppose, as well. But I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, there's some discussion around whether that should really get out of the way and just be telling people what it is, rather than being able to see all the dials and the inner workings as well. I mean, what's any kind of view on that?
Yeah, so AI is like having a chainsaw. If you want to chop a piece of wood up, fantastic. But if you have a chainsaw and you don't know what to do with it, then you've got a problem. It's a tool to solve a particular problem. Now, as someone with a shed full of power tools, most of which don't get used very often, I understand the attraction of the new. But I'm always interested to learn about these things, but not necessarily keen to apply them unless I see the right situation. Now, AI is interesting because it's a many-headed beast. So you've got machine learning, you've got a whole toolkit full of AI tools. Some of them are really, really interesting. I mean, I did a talk with a guy a year or so ago where he showed me these tools that can take unstructured data and extract meaningful queryable data from that unstructured data. So if you take most systems that I've worked with, you've got the structured side of things, name, address, postcode, and so on, and then these comments fields where stuff goes to die. Now, if you can use AI to actually extract insight from that, that's potentially really powerful, but you need to know what you want to answer. So AI is fine, BI tools are fine, but they are servants. They are there to help us make the right decision to get the right insight. So I kind of temper my excitement. There's an inner gadget freak who loves new shiny things, but I know that businesses very easily get distracted by that. And actually, it's fundamental questions about what are we here to do? What does success look like, and how do we move towards success? Those are the questions we need to be focusing on. And if we use those tools along the way, that's great, but they're not an end in themselves.
I quite like the analogy of I think about airline pilots actually, which is in KPIs, which is almost like you can remember the old days we used to knobs and dials. You used to be able to measure everything. You remember the back of the Concorde, everything, and you used to have an engineer, right? He used to sit at the back to measure.
You have one of these.
Yeah, exactly.
Bit of a tornado.
yeah. So they used to measure everything, right? And if you look at like a modern jet airliner up front, I mean, it's graphical displays, it's simplicity, it's about getting the information, and even links with AI, because you don't need to know all of the things that are going on, all the parameters. What you need to know is what's the outcome and what does that mean to you, and is that relevant to you? So it's almost like it's filtered and fed for the human to then digest it for the important information around outcomes.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, because we've all got a pretty low threshold over which we're overwhelmed. And if you're busy, if you're tired, if you're middle-aged, your capacity to process information is somewhat diminished. So one of the big challenges is shielding us from any of the noise and just focusing us in on the things that really need our attention. So yeah, so it's a very good point.
I've been reading your book, and so one of the questions that come up there is just like, how do you keep things going from a KPI point of view? So you obviously got the models in, you got the dashboards in, you started getting the measurements out, you got the business excited around it, but then things change over time. So how do you keep it fresh over time?
That's an interesting question. So I think it was Seth Godin came up with this concept called the dip. I don't know if you've come across it, but you definitely get it with KPIs. So what I'll do is sort of two-pronged process. Firstly, I'll warn people the dip is coming. So I'll say, you'll get excited about this, you feel really positive, and then actually the definition and implementation phase is a hard flog. So I'm honest with people up front about it, and also I'll hold their toes to the fire. We will agree up front that we're going to have regular check-ins, and it's like a fitness program in that you have to stick with it, and you will not get results until it's been fully bedded in. And for me, there's a kind of end goal that we're looking for here, and that end goal is people coming into the office or coming into the shop floor, and the first thing they look for are the performance figures. So when I was doing operational improvement in manufacturing, you knew that you'd basically got over the biggest hurdle when the shift supervisors come in, and the first thing they do is go over to the whiteboard, check out last shift's performance, see whether they've beaten the other shift. And as soon as they did that, you knew we're sorted, because they care so deeply about those KPIs that they're flying. So that's what we're aiming for, but it does take time. There is this big dip, and it does take discipline.
Good stuff. So when you look ahead, I suppose, what do you see as sort of like being on the horizon around, I suppose, data, analytics, KPIs, etc.? I mean, sort of we're in this sort of like much more digital world. We've probably got more data than we've ever had. I mean, and digital processes seem to drop data everywhere. I mean, what do you see as sort of being the challenges over the next sort of like 3-5 years?
So, I think this isn't just a challenge of now. This has always been a challenge, but we all need to start being a bit more unreasonable. If you don't understand it, if you are confused or overwhelmed, the problem is with what you're being presented with, not with you. So there's this tyranny that really is perpetuated by a lot of the software and data companies, which is, we'll just throw this stuff at you, and if you can't make intelligent decisions or you don't understand what's being thrown at you, then you're a bit stupid. And I think it's time that the customers of these organizations, be it internal or external customers, start being a bit more unreasonable and say, I want this to make sense. I want this to have meaning, and I want it to be contextualized for me. So, if you think about video recorders, I don't know how you are, but I'm old enough to remember that for a few years, teenagers were required to program video recorders because they were too hard for for adults to program. Now, if you ask an adult what they wanted, they say, yeah, I want you to record BBC One 7 o'clock next Friday. So they could perfectly articulate what they wanted. But the video recorders were bleeding impossible to program. And I think we're sort of at that stage still with data and analytics. You can explain what you want, the system can do it, but it hasn't been made simple and intuitive enough for mere mortals to do it. And I think it's where AI comes into play, and I think it's where good design comes into play. And I think we've still got a huge distance to go, where you can just, in natural language, explain what you want. It is presented, it is reliable, you trust it, and it helps you make the right decision. I think that's got to be the ultimate goal, rather than overcomplicating things. I think it's a more human-centric approach.
So, Bernie, thanks very much for making the time and chatting to me. I really appreciate it. It's always good to chat with you.
Absolute pleasure.
And we'll chat soon.
Thanks, Chris. Real pleasure. You take care.
Thanks.